Today's episode is sponsored by Jung Seed Company. Jung Seed Company has the largest selection of annual and perennial flowers and plants online. They are a family-owned and operated company since 1907. Use code 15FG podcast to receive 15% off your order at jungseed.com. That's JUNGSEED.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants, but not always the same ones. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jared Barnes. He is an associate professor at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas, and a frequent contributor to Fine Gardening. Dr. Jared also hosts the Plantastic podcast, which you can find on his website, meristemhorticulture.com, and we will drop a link in our show notes for that show, because I'm sure you are all going to want to check it out. Welcome to the podcast, Jared.
Thanks, Carol. It's great to be on today.
Before we begin, I was hoping you could tell our readers a little, or our listeners a little bit about what gardening is like in Nacogdoches, Texas, because I think you are gardening in a region that many of us are not familiar with.
Yes, well, I can sum it up with one word: extreme. Because in East Texas, in the past 10 years that I've lived here, I've seen extreme cold. In 2021, we were negative 6 degrees Fahrenheit. For point of reference, we're zone 8B, which means that usually our minimum temperatures are somewhere around 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Occasionally we'll drop down to like 12 or 11. But negative 6 basically put us up around 6A, which, growing up in West Tennessee, I was 6B growing up. And then, of course, the zone shifted a little bit. So that's one end of the scale, is extreme cold. The other end is extreme heat. Last summer, we were 116 degrees Fahrenheit. And then on top of that, the wet versus the dry. Last summer we had a very extended drought where we didn't get rain for a long period of time. I know that there's been other years like 2011, 2012 was really bad. And normally people hear Texas and they think cacti. But being in East Texas, we get 50 inches of rainfall a year. But in 2011, 2012 or so, they got 20 inches of rain. And this year we're particularly wet. Last Sunday night we got 4.6 inches of rain in 3 hours. And there have been times where we've got 6 inches, we've gotten 10 inches in 3 days. So being this close to the coast and being still under the influence of the temperate weather patterns that come down from Canada, and it's extreme.
Sounds like it. I've always been surprised at the overlap between the plants that you can grow there and the plants that we're growing up here in New England. So it's maybe not as different as people might think, but those extremes sound like you've got to have some tough plants.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, too, I do is I try to seek out plants that have southern provenance, that have genetics that are native to, Louisiana, instead of maybe genetics that are native to Pennsylvania. Because a lot of times these plants that are down here in the South are used to low chilling requirements, the heat, the humidity, wet spells, dry spells. But yes, there are a number of northeastern, mid-Atlantic, East Coast plants that we can grow here. But I've also learned a lot of them we can kill as well too. So
Absolutely. Well, we can all kill them, I guess. But it's us killing it, not the weather.
right.
Since we've started doing these longer format interviews, I've been asking nearly every guest this question. And that is, can you share a little bit about your earliest memories of plants and gardening? And is there any pivotal experience that put you on the path toward studying plants and teaching horticulture?
Yeah, sure. So there's a photograph of me. I'm 4 or 5 years old, and I'm out hoeing corn and tomatoes. And I've got the biggest smile on my face ever because I have loved plants since a very young age. I've always loved the natural sciences, weather, geology, looking at the stars from a very young age. But, plants was definitely a seminal moment for me as a young person because, you could put a seed in the ground, watch it grow, and then harvest something. And one of the people who was very influential on this was my great grandfather, E. E. Conley. My parents supported me as well too, but they both worked days, and so we would go up to my grandmother's house, and her dad, E. E. Conley, he and I would go out and work in his vegetable garden together. And so he would till, and I would follow behind, raking out our footsteps. As like a 6, 7 year old, and that was just cherished moments in the summertime. So he started me a little garden plot, and so I started growing my own tomatoes and growing on sunflowers and stuff, etc. And when I was 13, he passed away. And so that left a hole in my life, and sort of this source of knowledge and wisdom about how to grow plants was gone. And so I started turning to books. I started buying books, and the internet was a new thing. So I started getting on reading about companion planting and herbs and everything else. And when I was 14, my mom mentioned that there was a local Master Gardener group starting up. And so I joined. I just turned 15 whenever I joined, but my mom had to drive me because of the fact that I didn't have a driver's license, and my dad worked afternoon shift at Goodyear. And so from there, I learned about you could have a career in horticulture, and had people point me in the direction of studying, environmental science at my undergrad at University of Tennessee at Martin. They didn't have a horticulture program, so I did botany there. And then eventually on to PhD and master's at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. So that's my life in 2 minutes.
And you knew going into college that you wanted to study plants.
I did, yeah. It's funny. I went in to get advised by my college professor, and he says, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to get a PhD so that I can teach people about plants. And he was like, okay. I think part of that is that I'd gone to some of these garden shows, and I had seen Alan Armitage. I went and saw Alan Armitage in Nashville and bought every book he had. And I asked him, I was like, what do I do to do this? Because you're up in front of a group of people sharing your knowledge about plants, and that just looks like the bee's knees to me. And he said, well, if you find a graduate program and pursue that, I think that that's something you could really look into. And so that was kind of the direction that I took. And my parents too were encouraging me. They saw that I had this passion for sharing knowledge, that a lot of my friends and stuff kid around that I'm kind of this encyclopedia of information that I can pull out on a whim. So I think I just played to my strengths and played to the gifts and talents that I have.
You did, I understand, an internship, I believe it was between undergrad and graduate school at the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College.
That's correct,
Can you
yeah.
tell us a little bit about that experience?
That was fantastic. I got to work with Andrew Bunting up there, who, a lot of people in the horticulture world know him from Magnolias. And of course, he's now the vice president of horticulture at the PHS, Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And so that summer was wonderful, because what it did is it really showed me the sort of upper echelon of horticulture, because growing up in Tennessee, I was trying to figure out how to grow these things, just understand it. And then it's almost like going to Pennsylvania and having that internship was, just like the sort of the craft of people who have been doing it for so long and trying to figure out how to do it the best way possible. And that's something that I've always pursued in my life, is trying to figure out if there's a way of doing something, what's the best way. And so, whether it's weeding or fertilizing or taking care of plants, when to cut them back, how to manage them, the potting, one of the things we were responsible for as interns there were the containers. And so, how do you water it? How do you edit a container? That was a novel concept to me. How do you take a container that maybe has some yellowing leaves, brown leaves, things that are starting to look a little awry, and then go in and remove those to freshen it up. So definitely going up there. And then the other thing too that was a great blessing with that was all the connections I made, because, I was basically input into, as people call it, the garden mecca of the United States, because there's just so many great gardens up there, like Chanticleer and Longwood. And on the weekends, I took advantage of that. I went to every garden I could potentially find while I was in that area. And so it was definitely a deep dive, a 2-month deep dive into the horticulture that, Brandywine, River Valley area.
Yes, that is one of the horticultural jewels of our country. I think there are at least, I don't know, is it like 100 gardens?
There's a lot within a couple, yeah. And one of the people who recommended me for the internship, Stephanie Cohen, the perennial diva, She, of course, was a wonderful mentor of mine early on, and so she gave me a book on the gardens of Philadelphia region, and so I used that as a great guide to try to figure out where all would be worthy of going.
Oh, excellent. Oh, everyone should have that experience in their life. What a cool summer that must have been. And then you did your graduate work at NC State University in Raleigh. What was that experience like, and what was your thesis? What did you focus on?
Yeah, sure. So the experience in North Carolina was wonderful because what it did is it started to teach me systems and processes of thinking about the world and organizing information. And so for me, my master's was looking at diagnosing nutrient disorders of flowering plants. And so my advisor, Dr. Brian Whipker, he focused on building a hydroponic system so that we could basically give a plant like, let's say, sage. We could get ornamental sage. We could give it all the nutrients, or all the nutrients minus nitrogen, all the nutrients minus phosphorus, all the nutrients minus potassium. And what we were doing is we were basically cataloging the symptoms that we saw on that. And so, nitrogen deficient plants would show yellowing, phosphorus deficient plants would show purpling, and on down the list, some of the classic ones. And so we ran 12 different crops through of ornamental crops. And basically his focus was trying to build a library of resources for growers because he was an extension specialist. People who don't know what extension specialist is, this is a person who specializes in helping growers that are in the state figure out how to grow things better, or helping people in the state, grow things better. So sometimes they're more geared toward commercial, sometimes more home gardener. But the idea is that using research to help educate people. And so that was my master's. My PhD was a little bit more in depth. Long story short, for listeners out there, this is going to be like the 1 minute synopsis of all that data and research. But I think most listeners out there are familiar with soil pH. And soil pH influences nutrient availability in the soil. And so, fascinatingly enough, when plants take up nutrients, they can actually change the pH of the soil directly around them. And so this is very critical whenever you're growing plants in small containers, because your pH swings can very rapidly go up or down. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a model that would show if you gave plants a certain amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, 6 of the big elements plants need, how they would influence that growing media pH. And so, our research showed that we were some of the first people ever to show that phosphorus and potassium do have a definitive effect on substrate pH. And so that was really cool. And we were able to model nitrogen as well too. People who want to go and look at those theses, they're online. Just search NCSU Jared Barnes ETD, electronic thesis and dissertation, and you can read those and even fall asleep to them if you want to. Because the master's is like 216 pages, I think, and I think the PhD one was like 160, 170 pages. But it's a lot of dry material. But the fact that's part of research, though, is doing the stuff that no one else wants to find answers about things.
Yeah, and you got to collect all that data, and
you sure
and then
do.
Later you can fall asleep to it if you want, but it seems like important research and interesting. And now just a few years later, you're a college professor and you're sharing your knowledge and enthusiasm with a whole new generation of plant lovers. How long have you been at the Stephen F. Austin State University?
We're coming up on 10 years. July 1st will be 10 years. So it's
right after your PhD, or did you do something sort of?
Yeah, I did a little 6-month postdoc at NC State. My advisors, I meant to mention too that my advisor for the PhD was Dr. Paul Nelson, but Dr. Whipker and then Dr. John Dole and we worked together on a postdoc, basically looking at some other nutrient effect things. But after that, I started here in July of 2014. So graduated with a PhD in December 2013. And then started here July 1st, 2014. I was 28. I was 28 whenever I started here. So I was a young, fresh face. Some people at first, when you'd be working outside or something, they would think you were a student. I'm like, no.
Right.
So.
And was this around the time you were in Organic Gardening magazine, and that's when I first heard about you? Is this around that time, or is this before then?
Yeah, I got that phone call when I was at a ASHS meeting, which is Society of Hort Science, for people out there who aren't familiar with it. But I got that. I was in California, and they reached out to me while I was on that trip and was like, "Hey, we'd love to feature in organic gardening." So that was really cool. But yes, that was probably about 2013 or so. So yes, that was great coming out around the time I was hired.
Yes, yeah, and I
Yeah.
believe they highlighted you as like an up and coming star
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
world
Yeah.
of horticulture. And I
Yeah. Definitely.
remember, yeah, I had saved all of my organic gardening magazines. I remember
Yeah.
bringing that to a meeting and saying we should really talk to this guy.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. That's the cool thing about these conversations is that you never know what's going to arise from them. So.
Yeah. How has the agriculture, you're in the agriculture department, is that
That's
correct?
correct.
At the
Yes. Yeah.
university? And how has that department changed in the time that you've been there?
Well, we've been growing pretty consistently over the past 5 years. I think we've had a 12% bump, and the university has fortunately realized that yeah, we're a growing program. Definitely had some turnover. We've had gone through a couple of department heads. We've got one now that's really really great to work with, and the other thing too is that the environment in the department has changed. Whenever I first started here, it was kind of more of a silo feel, where people kind of worked on their own projects, but now it feels more like a family, where people are supporting each other and helping each other out, and so that's been really great to witness that change. Because when I came from NC State, I had this team focus that multiple people working together, and I think part of that is just new fresh blood coming into the department, helping to invigorate things and people who are passionate and really engaged with the students. But the other thing too is that we get great students in here. One of our graduates, he's out. He's out in Oregon. He helps with like running a drone company. We've got another student who she is in Hawaii. She does garden design in Hawaii. So our students end up all over the place doing some really really cool projects.
That's excellent. What a great
Yeah.
start they're getting. I follow the SFA horticulture hashtag on
Yes.
Instagram, and that is such a fun feed. And
Thank
we
you.
will link to that in the show notes because you all
Thank
need to
you.
be following this feed. So that's where I first heard about the Plantery. But can you please tell
Yes.
everyone what is the Plantery?
Yeah, and first of all, I'll give a shout out to one of our students, Katie, who she just recently graduated. We will miss her deeply, but she was the one who cultivated the Instagram feed. She was thrilled one day that like one of her videos got 100,000 views or something like that. So again, it's just playing off that student passion. So whenever I came here in 2014, I wanted a space for students to be able to develop their own projects and do things and really sort of have a student garden. And there was an area that was down along the creek just below, and they called it the SFA Sustainable Education Community Garden. And I was just like, that's too long of a name, so we rebranded it as Sprout. And so we started growing, we continued growing vegetable produce, broccoli, kale, collards, carrots, and people love coming to our markets. And so it was a fundraiser for us, teaching students how to grow plants and then selling them. So what I tell people is that one of the things our program does is goes from seed to sale, where we take students through the whole process of growing plants. So in June 2015, it was a great summer. I'd almost been an SFA for a year. We had 200 tomato plants in the ground. We had 100 pepper plants. We had cut flowers out the wazoo, sunflowers, celosia, etc. And Tropical Storm Bill came and dumped 6-7 inches of rain on the ground, and overnight. And within 3 hours, there was 3 to 4 feet of flood water over the garden. And that was a horrific, depressing moment for me as a young horticulture professor, because once floodwaters hit an area, you can't harvest the produce that you've grown. One, and two, you can't grow anything there for like 90 days because of the fact of E. coli and stuff that may have contaminated it, that you risk reintroducing that. So we would then have to wait another 90 days. And so I came in the next day just distraught, and my colleague and friend at the time, Dawn Stover, who she doesn't work here anymore, but she came to me and she's like, look at this area around the agriculture building. Why don't you start thinking about refreshing it and bringing a fresh face to it? And so that's what I started working on. Is we overhauled some perennial borders out to the side of the building that were kind of overgrown, and that old holly's shrubs there. We turned that into an edible garden, and we rebranded that as Sprout. So that still had that name. So because again, people started building up familiarity with that concept. Well, eventually we started taking over other areas around the ag building, and eventually we got more space in the greenhouse and the polyhouse. The next thing you know, we had the whole area. So we decided that we needed to rebrand because it wasn't just edibles anymore. It was trying to provide students a full gamut of experiences here at SFA: nursery production, sustainable plantings, cut flowers, color gardening, perennials, trying to do a little bit of everything to get people the full breadth of horticulture. So we rebranded as Plantery. And so that's something that students and I came up with. And, it's just like a bakery. It's just a plantery. So we just put the name ER on the end of it. It's kind of cool because around town you started seeing like the cafeteria who's rebranded themselves Eatery. And there was somewhere else the other day we saw like the cookery or something like that. And so I think what it is it's just kind of this concept of trying to provide short names that really convey what you do, because there's research out there that students and young people don't engage with the word garden, that's something my grandparents do, but plants, yeah, that's where the word really focuses on. So that's part of the reason why working with students, we chose the name Plantery.
Neat. And I notice in your in the Instagram feed that you're often encouraging people from outside of the agriculture department to come and visit, get involved at the plantery. How has this cross-pollination with the rest of your community benefited your students and the horticulture program?
Well, that's a great question. So here on campus, I teach an intro horticulture class, and it's called Cultivating Plants. Again, instead of calling it horticulture, intro to horticulture, we just called it Cultivating Plants because we're trying to show people what plants are. I teach the class, and first or second day I'll ask who's never heard of the word horticulture, and 5 to 10% of the hands in the class go up. But the reason I bring up that class, talking about the cross-pollination, is that class is for majors and non-majors. And so I have students who take the class who are business majors, art majors, sports majors, criminal justice majors. I mean, really across the board on campus. And what's so cool is that, they come in with interesting questions. They come in with interesting ideas. Some of them have never grown a plant before, or they've never sown a seed before. I mean, think about that, Carol. Like, I have students coming into my class who have never sown a seed in their entire life. And, you'll hear it every semester, oh, this plant's going to die. And then they get it through the entire semester and they've kept it alive, and they're just like, holy cow, I didn't know this was even possible, that I could do this. And of course we're helping them. But still, nevertheless, it is a lot of fun to engage with them and see that. The other thing too is that, I have students that work with me in the plantery as well. And so I've had students that are organizational business majors, animal science majors, forestry majors, environmental science, but math majors, all across the board. And so bringing these fresh ideas into horticulture, sort of grafting to different groups of people, has really helped us out, because suddenly you'll have somebody who's more business minded, and so they can help us out with building our marketing. We have somebody else who really knows a lot about woodworking, so they can help us build signage. And to me, that's the beautiful thing about horticulture, is just that we've got to figure out ways to bridge ourselves to other groups of people so that we can help grow plants and help to connect that love of horticulture with others.
It's interesting, and it sort of points to a broader idea that, when you're at a university, you have this opportunity to explore new interests and things you maybe never even knew existed before. Do you have students that cross over from other majors once they discover horticulture?
Oh yeah, we've had transfers in. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Where people don't realize it's a career, they take the intro hort class, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Holy cow, I didn't know I could do this." Sometimes though, they're too far into their program, so to change over would be like too many hours. So in those cases, sometimes students come back to us for masters, where they're like, "Holy cow, I didn't know this was an option. I'm in my senior year. Did I do a master's?" And so usually there might be some leveling classes they have to take. But yes, I think part of the draw of horticulture is just having these classes available for students to take, and then opening their eyes up to the careers and options available.
Yeah, absolutely. What types of careers do your students pursue after their
So
graduation?
our program is primarily focused on more of the growing side of things, and then also the home landscaper type side of things as well too. So we have some people who go to professional grower operations, so they'll go grow annuals, perennials here in Texas. Like I mentioned earlier, like we have one student who he went up and worked for an orchard. They grew hazelnuts for Nutella. And so every time I cracked open a container of Nutella to put on my crepes, which we cook on Saturday mornings, a lot of mornings, I thought of him. But then he went on to do a side job in drones and actually ended up selling his business because it was so successful. And then we have some students who go on to do design. We have other students who they work at small garden centers and nursery. We've got another alumni who's working over in the Hill Country area. So he works at a water garden place there. Some students go on to work at turf grass management. So my other colleague here, Dr. Michael Maurer, he teaches turf grass management courses, irrigation courses as well too. And so we have a student who just graduated, and they're going to go down and work with the Houston Astros. So it's just kind of across the gamut as far as what students are interested in. The biggest thing though that we tell students is that if you're interested in plants, there is a career out there for you, because you go to these career trade fairs, you go to these conferences where they have the booths set up for all the people. I mean, the job boards are full because people are just so desperate to look. You may have to move. You may have to move to a different city or different state. But, there is opportunities out there for you. It's not just mow, blow, and go. There are opportunities. And another resource, too, I share with students is the resource seedyourfuture.com. I don't know if you heard of it, Carol, that reference website. So Seed Your Future is a nonprofit. It was started by several organizations coming together and saying, we've got to do something to correct this decline in horticulture interest. And so Seed Your Future has a lot of wonderful resources on it. They show jobs that you can get with plants, and they also show the expected salary ranges for those. They have internship information on there. They have scholarship information on there broken down by state. So that's a wonderful resource out there for students who are listening, or if you're someone who is a gardener, a professional horticulturist, or something listening to this, and you know someone who's interested in horticulture and pursuing it, definitely share that resource with them, because again, it's a wonderful thing that people can turn to who haven't figured out what career they want. Even people who want to return to a second career in horticulture, I know the website's been useful.
Excellent. And we'll put a link in the show notes. I wrote that down because I had never heard of it before. My husband works at Fine Home Building, and he has been involved with an organization that is now called Spark, but it used to be called Touch a Trade, and that is an organization that is designed to get people into the building trades. And it sounds
nice.
like Seed Your Future is very similar, but for horticulture. So that is great to know that that's out there as a resource.
Yeah, they've tried to look at it and ask what is every barrier that is preventing people from entering into horticulture. They don't know about it. Okay, boom. Let's start getting more science resources out into the 3rd, 4th grade, 5th grade, studies. We don't know where scholarships are. Boom. Let's make a web page for all the scholarships you can get broken down state by state. So it's a wonderful resource. So yeah, thanks for helping to promote it and share it in your show notes.
Yeah, excellent. What kinds of events do you and your students host for your university community and the community at large?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So every fall and spring, we have a spring plant fair and a fall plant fair. And so the idea is that we take plants that students have grown and raised, and then we sell them to the public. And so for us, this has become a great fundraiser. It's also become a fun event as well, too. For the ones that we host on Saturday mornings, we usually have like a little pancake breakfast as well too. So free pancakes. Come eat you some breakfast and then shop the plants that we have available. In the fall, we tend to take more of a fall fest approach. So we'll have like a little bonfire for s'mores and marshmallows. We have food. I like to eat, so I'm like, we've got to have food at this event. Food and plants, that always goes well together. But then we've also had other things like cornhole, where people play yard games and stuff, etc. And then of course last fall we had a grand opening our native plant trial garden, which is something that we worked on over the past year. And so we had luminaries set out and welcome people to come out. And so we had a really good turnout. We had live music as well too. So, usually we attract, a couple hundred people to these events. And then within the department, we do other events as well too. Every spring we host an FFA competition where we get around 3,000 high school students come to the university. And so that helps us to connect again with students, high school students across the state. And in the fall too, our department hosts a college experience day. And so the idea there is that we get people who are interested in different careers like horticulture or ag business or ag development, ag mechanics. They get to come and learn about that trade, so we'll do a little activity with them as well too. So part of being a horticulturist is just putting yourself out there and engaging with the public. We've got to do that more.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the biggest problem with people not getting into these trades or these businesses is just not knowing that opportunity exists.
Right.
So another way besides teaching that you share your passion for plants with the outside world is the Plantastic podcast, which what a great name for a podcast.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we didn't think of that first, but and I know our listeners are always looking for more podcasts to follow that
Sure.
plant-based. So we'll put a link in the show notes. And you've done some incredible interviews, and I'm not going to ask you to pick a favorite, but if someone's just getting into it, are there a couple of episodes that you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for highlighting this. It's definitely part of my passion to help cultivate the skills that gardeners need to grow. I bought the domain a long time ago. So it's kind of one of those things. Once I had the idea sort of flash in my head, I was like, oh, I've got to jump on this. And so I held it close for a couple of years. And I took some people may know the marketing guru, Seth Godin. They had a podcasting class. So I took that to try to learn the basics of it. But from there, it was just kind of off to the races. And so, for me, it's a once-a-month podcast. Episode goes live. However, we have had a little girl. We had a daughter born in July. Her name's Magnolia. So some of the episodes have been coming out a little bit later. But still, once-a-month podcast, I do my best to get them up on time. And really, it's just having conversations about plants and, whether you have a green thumb or a brown thumb, your plant killer, and everybody else in between. We're just trying to figure out ways to help people grow and cultivate their skill. I really try to address each episode, trying to figure out how can I get the most value out of a guest to help the listeners. And I think that you and probably everybody out there listening, somewhere there's a botanic garden or a gardening group near you where they'll host garden talks, like once a month or once a year, a quarter or whatever. And so that's kind of how I approach it is I bring on a guest and that's my garden talk for the month. And so I get to ask questions and listen to what they have to think and stuff, etc. So the most downloaded episode I can tell you is Thomas Rayner's episode, where, of course, he's the co-author of Planting in a Post-Wall World. So that one definitely gets a lot of hits. And I think part of the reason why is that right now there's just such an interest in naturalistic planting and ecological design. And so his is definitely one of the most listened to. Another one that's a very popular one is the one with Mary Phillips, who she, of course, talks about gardening for wildlife. And so that's another very popular one. Again, I think it just ties back into that ecological design. Recently, the one that I did with Preston Montague, and I got a lot of positive feedback on that one, where people just said, like, hey, this was a great episode. I really, really appreciate you sharing this. So, but yes, you're right. Every episode out there has a different flavor to it because I have so many colleagues and connections across the world. So I've interviewed landscape architects. I've interviewed book authors. It's so cool. I've interviewed a couple people in the UK. So who would have thunk, that I would be talking to that some southern boy out there would be talking to somebody in the UK. But yeah, it's definitely helped to elevate my thoughts about horticulture. And again, just to have an hour-long chat with someone where you can ask them, okay, what are your systems and processes? What do you think about this? How do you approach this topic? How do you think about that? It's been really great to delve into that. So yeah, thanks for asking about it.
Yeah, no problem. Were there any episodes that surprised you that you went in thinking it was going to go one way and it went another way?
The one I did with Matt Biggs, he was one of my guests from the UK. That was just stellar. He and I just had such a wonderful conversation, and again, two people who did not know each other at all, and just jumped right in. And it's almost like we became friends. I mean, if we go to the UK, we've corresponded occasionally over the email and stuff. But if we go back, I'm definitely going to hit him up and ask him. He wrote a book on basically plants around the world. And so it was beautifully illustrated, and we have a copy for our little daughter Magnolia as well too. So, but I've enjoyed reading that with her. But just again going into these podcasts, you never know what little gems and nuggets are going to rise and come to the top. But that's one that definitely pops to the top as far as going into it, not knowing what to expect, and coming out the other end feeling like you made a friend.
Yeah, plant people are the best.
They are the best.
They
That's
are
right.
the best. And I used to, when I was new at this job, I used to be nervous about meeting new authors or, going out in the world and doing the work. But I don't anymore, because I just know if this is a plant person, they're going to be cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What's next for you and your students? Any plans in the works? Any new ideas coming up?
Well, that's a good question. We're definitely taking sort of a break here because building the native plant trial garden was a massive investment in time and resources. And on top of that, having a daughter. So the past year has been a bit crazy. But one of the things we're going to do is definitely with that native plant trial garden, we are going to be working on installing native plant trials for the Southeast. So some of your listeners out there may be familiar with the Mount Cuba trials that, of course, they do. And then, of course, Fine Gardening has posted the trial results from the Chicago Botanic Gardens before. I've seen the research reports before that y'all have co-published in there as well, too, from the great work they do up there. So we're going to try to do something here for the Southeast where we take a genera. And our first group that we're going to do is some of the native ornamental grasses, grow as many different selections as we can find, and then try to provide really good research data on which ones grow well for us here in the Southeast. And so that's something really, really cool that's sort of on the horizon for us to pursue coming up soon.
All right. Well, we hope we will be able to cover those trials sometime in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. And
yes.
Thanks for telling us more about what it is you do.
Sure thing. My pleasure. I really appreciate y'all asking. And thank you again for doing this great service to gardeners everywhere. I know it's a time commitment to do a podcast, but, so many people out there listen and get great advice from me. So, again, thank you for all you do, Carol.